Hi guys, tonight we're stepping softly into the rise and fall of Richard Nixon, a man who climbed higher than almost anyone in American politics, only to watch everything crumble beneath his feet. This story will move gently through his victories, his fears, and the quiet unraveling that led to one of the most dramatic moments in White House history. No drama, no rush, just a calm walk through the life of a president who changed a nation and then lost everything. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Richard Nixon's story begins far from the marble floors of Washington, in a small California town where nothing came easily, and every dream had to be carved out of hardship. He was born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, surrounded by the quiet struggles of a working-class family, where days were shaped by the dusty heat, the smell of citrus groves, and the weight of responsibility that arrived far too early. His parents ran a small grocery store and gas station, and Nixon spent long hours helping, watching the rhythm of ordinary people's lives, noticing how much worry they carried and how much strength they used just to keep going. These early years didn't give him comfort or privilege, but they gave him something else, a rigid sense of discipline, a habit of silence, and the belief that the world rewarded only those who refused to give up. School for Nixon wasn't glamorous, but he excelled quietly, always observant, always pushing himself a little further than yesterday. He wasn't the loudest student or the most popular, yet teachers saw a spark in him, a determination that felt heavier, older, almost as if he carried the weight of adulthood long before time demanded it. When his family faced tragedy after losing two of his brothers to illness, the world around Nixon darkened, teaching him early that life could shift suddenly, without warning or fairness. But instead of breaking, he buried the grief deep inside and kept moving, believing that achievement could give structure to the chaos he couldn't control. As he grew older, the idea of public service started to take shape, not from dreams of power, but from the simple, steady desire to matter, to do something larger than the quiet world he was born into. He studied relentlessly, earned scholarships, and eventually found his path leading toward law, where he discovered his sharp analytical mind, his talent for argument, and his ability to read people like careful puzzles. Yet even in those early successes, Nixon carried a sense of distance, as if he stood slightly apart from the world he worked so hard to join. People noticed his brilliance, but they also sensed the tension beneath it, a quiet storm of ambition mixed with insecurity, pushing him forward and holding him back at the same time. When he met Pat Ryan, the woman who would become his wife, it was one of the few moments in his life when warmth cut through the seriousness that usually defined him. Their connection was slow, gentle, built on shared values rather than sudden passion. Pat believed in him, sometimes more than he believed in himself, and that steady support became one of the few emotional anchors Nixon ever allowed close. By his late 20s, he was ready to step onto the political stage, carrying with him all the discipline of his childhood, the hunger for achievement, and the shadows that would eventually shape his presidency. His journey toward power had begun, quietly, confidently, and with the promise of something extraordinary ahead, long before anyone imagined how complicated that journey would become. Richard Nixon's entry into politics came almost unexpectedly, yet it unfolded with the same steady determination that had shaped his early life. When he returned from serving in the Navy during World War II, he found a country shifting, rebuilding, searching for new leaders who understood both conflict and stability. Nixon, quiet but fiercely focused, stepped forward when local Republicans encouraged him to run for Congress. He wasn't a natural showman, but he had something rarer, an ability to study every issue with precision and speak with calm conviction that made people believe he understood their fears. His first campaign was marked by long days, modest events, and a relentless work ethic that soon became his trademark. Voters saw a young veteran who carried himself with seriousness and restraint, someone who seemed older than his years but driven by an almost unshakable commitment. When he won his seat, it became clear that Nixon wasn't just another new politician. He was a rising figure with the potential to shape national conversations. In Washington, he approached every task with the same intense discipline that had guided him since childhood. He studied legislation late into the night, took detailed notes, and prepared obsessively for every hearing. His style wasn't warm or charismatic, but it was effective. People respected the depth of his preparation and the firmness of his arguments. During his time on the House Un-American Activities Committee, Nixon gained national attention for his role in the Alger Hiss case, a moment that placed him firmly in the public eye. Though controversial, it showed his willingness to stand his ground even when pressure mounted around him. This determination brought him both admiration and criticism, but it undeniably pushed his career upward. Soon he moved to the Senate, where his influence only grew. He remained distant in personality, guarded even among colleagues, yet no one doubted his intelligence or drive. Reporters described him as intense, private, and deliberate, a man competing not with others, but with his own inner expectations. By the early 1950s, his reputation reached the attention of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who saw in Nixon a disciplined young leader capable of balancing the administration's needs. When Eisenhower chose him as his vice presidential running mate, Nixon entered a new chapter, stepping closer to the heights he had once only imagined. But with that rise came heavier scrutiny, and shadows that followed him quietly into the White House, where success and pressure began to intertwine in ways that would reshape the path ahead. Nixon's ascent to the vice presidency placed him in a position unlike anything he had experienced before, close enough to power to feel its weight, yet distant enough to understand that every step mattered. Serving under President Eisenhower, he became known for his discipline, loyalty, and willingness to take on difficult assignments that others avoided. Eisenhower often relied on him for international missions, sending him abroad as a representative of American strength during a tense era defined by the Cold War. These trips revealed a new side of Nixon, calm under pressure, composed in chaotic moments, and skilled in navigating conversations with world leaders who carried their own burdens of conflict and uncertainty. Yet despite his growing stature, he struggled to be fully understood by the public. Nixon wasn't naturally charismatic. He wasn't a man who inspired crowds simply by entering a room. Instead, he influenced through preparation, detail, and persistence. During his second term as vice president, the political climate became increasingly harsh, with critics focusing intensely on him. He worked tirelessly to maintain his integrity, often absorbing attacks quietly, while continuing to meet the demands of his role. One of the most defining moments of these years came long before Watergate, during the famous Chequers speech, where he defended his integrity on national television. It was an emotional, vulnerable moment, and millions watched as Nixon spoke directly to the American people with unusual openness. The speech saved his place on the ticket and revealed the complicated balance inside him, the blend of earnestness and defensiveness that would follow him throughout his career. By the end of the Eisenhower administration, Nixon had become one of the most well-known political figures in the country. He had experienced the strain and expectation of standing beside a beloved president, and he had learned how deeply public perception could shift with one headline, one speech, or one misunderstanding. In 1960, he set his sights on the presidency, stepping into a race that would become one of the closest in American history. Facing John F. Kennedy, youthful, polished, and effortlessly charismatic, Nixon found himself in a contest defined as much by presence as by policy. The first televised debate showed this clearly. Kennedy appeared relaxed and confident, while Nixon, recovering from illness and refusing makeup, looked tired under the harsh studio lights. Even though his words were strong, viewers saw a man fighting the camera rather than commanding it. The narrow loss that followed was a painful blow, one that settled heavily on his shoulders. Many assumed his political career had ended, But Nixon, shaped by years of perseverance, stepped back quietly rather than giving in to defeat. He returned to private life, carrying with him lessons about image, endurance, and the unpredictable nature of public trust. Lessons that would shape his unexpected return in the years ahead. Nixon's withdrawal from the national stage after the 1960 election was quiet but filled with reflection. He returned to California, attempting to rebuild both his public image and his personal balance after years of relentless political pressure. For a time, he focused on practicing law and spending more peaceful moments with his family, believing that perhaps life outside Washington might offer a different kind of fulfillment. But the call of public service never entirely left him. In 1962, he made a bid for governor of California, hoping to re-establish himself as a leader capable of guiding his home state. The campaign, however, unfolded with tension and exhaustion. Nixon found himself worn down by the constant criticism, the hostile press coverage, and the emotional strain that followed him since the Kennedy defeat. When he lost the race, the disappointment was sharp and immediate, culminating in his famous remark to reporters that they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. For many Americans, it seemed like the closing chapter of his political life. Yet beneath the frustration, Nixon understood something essential. He needed distance, time, and a chance to see the world beyond the immediate judgments of the moment. Over the next several years, he began to travel internationally, observing geopolitical shifts with the same careful attention he had carried since his early days in Congress. He met with foreign leaders, studied the evolving dynamics of the Cold War, and quietly shaped a deeper understanding of global strategy. These journeys allowed him to return to politics with a broader view, and more importantly with a calmer inner focus. He wrote books, gave thoughtful speeches, and rebuilt his reputation piece by piece, presenting himself as a statesman rather than a combative figure. Slowly, public opinion softened. The country was changing. The war in Vietnam escalated, social tensions rose, and Americans sought leadership that felt experienced and steady. By the mid-1960s, the idea of Nixon returning didn't seem far-fetched anymore. Supporters encouraged him to run again, believing that his resilience and knowledge made him uniquely prepared for a turbulent era. Nixon listened carefully. He had been humbled, tested, and reshaped by defeat, and the lessons he carried softened some of his defensiveness while deepening his confidence. When he finally announced his candidacy for the 1968 presidential election, it was not with the fiery ambition of youth, but with a quiet, controlled determination. He presented himself as a figure of stability during a year marked by unrest, promising to restore order and guide the nation through uncertainty. This time, the country was ready to hear him, and Nixon, older and more measured, was ready to lead again, stepping back into the political arena with the knowledge that second chances rarely come easily, but sometimes come exactly when they are needed most. The 1968 presidential campaign placed Richard Nixon in the center of one of the most turbulent years in modern American history. The nation was shaken by protests, the Vietnam War, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, events that deepened a sense of uncertainty across the country. Nixon entered the race promising law and order, a phrase meant to reassure Americans longing for stability. Unlike his earlier campaigns, he approached this one with remarkable discipline and a calm, deliberate strategy. He avoided emotional outbursts, stayed focused on measured speeches, and portrayed himself as a figure capable of steady leadership. His team crafted what became known as the New Nixon, emphasizing composure, maturity, and thoughtful decision-making. Nixon traveled the country, speaking to audiences who worried about rising tensions and divisions. Many saw in him a steady hand, someone who had been tested, who had fallen and risen again, and who carried a seriousness shaped by decades of experience. At the same time, he remained cautious, aware that every phrase could be misinterpreted. While other candidates leaned on dramatic appeals or charismatic style, Nixon leaned on clarity and predictability. His speeches were calm, sometimes almost understated, yet they resonated with people longing for a return to order. As the election unfolded, Nixon faced stiff competition: Vice President Hubert Humphrey and independent candidate George Wallace. The political climate was unpredictable, with shifting alliances and public emotions running high. Still, Nixon maintained his steady approach, offering a message built not on fiery promises, but on controlled assurance. When the results finally arrived, he won by a narrow margin. Not a sweeping victory, but a meaningful one. It marked an extraordinary comeback, a return from a place many believed he would never rise from again. Nixon felt both humbled and validated. He had spent years rebuilding himself, learning from loss and navigating the shadows of public doubt. And now he had been trusted with the presidency at a moment when the nation needed calm leadership more than ever. His victory speech reflected this tone: measured, hopeful, and filled with references to unity and healing. Yet as Nixon prepared to step into the Oval Office, the challenges ahead were immense. The Vietnam War continued, the country was deeply divided, and the responsibilities of leadership weighed heavily on him. Still, he believed he could guide the nation through the storm, relying on strategy, patience, and the quiet resilience that had shaped him from childhood. What he didn't yet know was that the same inner battles, the tension between confidence and insecurity, would follow him into the White House, influencing decisions that would define not only his presidency, but also the most dramatic fall from power in American history. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he did so with a sense of gravity that matched the moment. He wasn't triumphant or exuberant. Instead, he carried himself with a calm, almost solemn awareness of the responsibility now resting on him. The world was in flux, the nation was divided, and Nixon believed his role was to bring a steady hand to a turbulent era. One of the first and most pressing challenges was the Vietnam War. Nixon understood that the country was exhausted by years of conflict, yet he also knew that an immediate withdrawal could destabilize the region. His solution, which he called Vietnamization, aimed to gradually shift the burden of fighting to South Vietnamese forces while slowly bringing American troops home. It was a strategy built on caution, diplomacy, and a desire to avoid sudden collapse. Though controversial, it reflected Nixon's preference for methodical, long-term approaches rather than dramatic gestures. At the same time, Nixon began what would become one of the most significant foreign policy chapters in American history. He believed the global balance of power hinged on how the United States managed its relationships with the Soviet Union and China, two nations deeply involved in Cold War rivalries. Nixon, guided by his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, pursued a strategy of careful engagement. He initiated talks with the Soviets on limiting nuclear weapons, laying the groundwork for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But his boldest move was opening diplomatic communication with China after decades of silence. The idea of an American president travelling to Beijing seemed unimaginable, yet Nixon recognized the long-term importance of reshaping global alliances. As he prepared for that historic visit, he understood how much it could shift the world's geopolitical landscape. Domestically, Nixon focused on issues such as environmental protection, establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, and supporting clean air regulations. He also oversaw policies aimed at reducing inflation and improving economic stability, though the results were mixed and often challenged by global pressures. Throughout these early years, Nixon seemed composed and deeply involved in the technical, strategic side of governing. Yet behind the scenes, pressures continued to build. The constant scrutiny from the media, the protests across the country, and his own sense of mistrust toward political opponents created an internal tension that gradually shaped the mood inside the White House. Still, on the surface, Nixon appeared steady. He achieved major diplomatic breakthroughs, oversaw the beginning of troop withdrawals, and maintained the image of a president focused on global strategy more than public showmanship. It was a presidency unfolding with quiet intensity, filled with accomplishments that would redefine American foreign policy. But as time passed, subtle cracks began to form in the foundation. Small decisions, private fears, and a growing reliance on secrecy. the early shadows of a political storm that had not yet revealed its true strength. As Nixon's first term continued, the tension between his public achievements and his private anxieties grew steadily, shaping the atmosphere inside the White House in ways few outsiders understood. Although he had accomplished major diplomatic breakthroughs and made progress in winding down the Vietnam War, Nixon increasingly felt surrounded by critics, convinced that political enemies and the press were working tirelessly to undermine him. This feeling wasn't sudden. It had been part of him since his early career, but the intensity of the presidency amplified it. He began to rely heavily on a small inner circle, men who shared his distrust and worked to shield him from what they saw as constant attacks. Within this closed environment, secrecy became a habit rather than a necessity. Meetings were held quietly, decisions made privately, and information often moved through narrow channels. Nixon valued loyalty above all, which led him to create a tight group of advisors who operated with a sense of mission and protection. Among them were H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, two figures who managed much of the daily political strategy and worked to maintain a firewall between Nixon and the outside world. Their influence strengthened his tendency toward caution and secrecy, reinforcing the belief that transparency could be dangerous in a world filled with political traps. Meanwhile, the country continued to shift. Protests persisted, debates over civil rights and social policy intensified, and the constant flow of newspaper stories created a sense of unease in the administration. Though Nixon publicly presented himself as calm and measured, he privately expressed frustration that his achievements, especially in foreign policy, were not receiving the recognition he felt they deserved. The disconnect between his accomplishments and public perception pressed on him, deepening his sense of isolation. And yet, Nixon still pushed forward with major initiatives. His 1972 trip to China became one of the most widely watched diplomatic events in history, symbolizing a new era in global relations. The images of him shaking hands with Chinese leaders represented not only a geopolitical shift, but also a moment of international respect that Nixon deeply valued. It stands today as one of the most defining achievements of any American president. Soon after, Nixon also made strides with the Soviet Union, signing agreements aimed at reducing nuclear tensions and opening doors to further cooperation. These were monumental moments, the kind that could define an entire presidency. But beneath these successes, subtle warning signs continued to appear. Small decisions driven by fear, minor operations authorized in the shadows, and a growing belief that extraordinary measures were justified to protect the administration. These choices, barely noticed at first, would eventually form the early threads of a much larger unraveling. For now, however, Nixon remained confident. His approval ratings rose, the country took note of his foreign policy achievements, and the 1972 re-election campaign approached with a sense of inevitability. What he didn't yet realize was that the seeds of future calamity had already been planted quietly, in the very secrecy he believed was necessary for survival. The 1972 re-election campaign marked the peak of Richard Nixon's political power, a moment when victory seemed not only likely but guaranteed. His foreign policy achievements had elevated his reputation worldwide, and at home many Americans viewed him as a steady leader during uncertain times. The opposition appeared weak and divided, and Nixon's campaign team was determined to secure a landslide win that would cement his legacy. Yet inside the campaign, a different atmosphere was beginning to take shape, one defined by suspicion, intense pressure, and an overwhelming desire to eliminate even the smallest threat. Nixon himself often spoke about the importance of winning decisively, not simply for political prestige, but to send a message that his leadership was trusted by a wide majority of the nation. This mindset filtered down to his advisors, some of whom believed that ordinary campaigning was not enough. They felt the need to gather information, protect the president from perceived enemies, and maintain an advantage in any way possible. This led to the creation of a special group known informally as the Plumbers, originally formed to stop leaks of classified information and gather intelligence. Though Nixon did not micromanage their activities, he encouraged an environment where secrecy and unconventional tactics were normalized. As the campaign intensified, small covert operations were authorized without fully considering the consequences. Among these was an operation targeted at the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate office complex. The break-in, intended to gather political intelligence, seemed minor at the time, a risky but manageable move in the eyes of those who approved it. Nixon himself was not directly involved in planning it, yet the culture he fostered made such actions seem reasonable to those around him. When the burglars were caught, the story initially drew little national attention. Many saw it as an odd, almost accidental incident. But within the White House, there was growing concern about the potential fallout. Nixon and his advisors feared that any connection between the burglars and the campaign could become a distraction during an election year. Their instinct was not to reveal the full truth, but to contain the situation quickly. Discussions began about how to manage the investigation, what information should be shared, and how to prevent political damage. These decisions, made quietly and without a clear understanding of their long-term impact, marked the beginning of a deeper entanglement, one that would eventually overshadow every accomplishment of Nixon's presidency. Despite the hidden anxiety, the election moved forward smoothly. Nixon won in a historic landslide, carrying 49 out of 50 states. It was the kind of political triumph he had dreamed of for decades. But beneath the celebration, the first cracks had already formed, unnoticed by most but destined to grow. The victory, though overwhelming, would soon be eclipsed by the consequences of choices made in secrecy. Choices that would set the stage for the most dramatic fall of a president in American history. Nixon began his second term with a sense of immense confidence, believing that the overwhelming victory of 1972 had finally secured the validation he had sought for so many years. He felt stronger, more assured, and more determined than ever to leave behind a legacy defined by diplomatic breakthroughs and national stability. Yet even as he moved forward with ambitious plans, the quiet shadows cast by the Watergate break-in began to stretch longer across the edges of his presidency. At first, the issue seemed small enough to ignore. The public knew little, and the press hadn't yet grasped the significance of the early details. Inside the White House, however, discussions became tense. A few advisors understood that the break-in had connections reaching far closer to the administration than anyone wanted to admit. They debated how to respond, how much to reveal, and how to keep the story contained until it faded away. Nixon's instinct, influenced by years of political scars, was to protect the presidency from unnecessary controversy. He believed that opponents would exploit even minor mistakes to weaken his leadership. This belief shaped his decisions in the early days of the unfolding situation. Rather than exposing the full truth, Nixon and his inner circle focused on controlling information, limiting disclosures, and reassuring each other that the story would disappear. But outside the White House, the landscape was shifting. Journalists began digging more deeply into the details of the break-in, noticing inconsistencies in statements and unusual connections among the burglars. What started as a small headline gradually became a growing thread, with reporters piecing together what seemed at first like minor irregularities. Slowly, questions multiplied. Meanwhile, Nixon attempted to proceed normally with his agenda. He focused on foreign policy initiatives, continued discussions with the Soviet Union, and looked for ways to strengthen domestic programs. On the surface, his second term moved forward with calm determination, but underneath, tension grew. Each new article, each small revelation, each whisper of further investigation added to the pressure. Some advisors began to feel uneasy, recognizing that efforts to contain the story might only deepen the problem. Yet they found it difficult to shift course. The culture inside the administration, built on secrecy, distrust, and a fierce desire to avoid political vulnerability, made honesty feel risky and openness feel dangerous. Nixon, who had always seen the world through a lens of competition and suspicion, struggled to imagine that transparency could protect him better than control. And so, the decisions made in those early months, decisions that felt safe in the moment, quietly set the stage for a crisis that would soon grow beyond anyone's ability to manage. For now, though, the storm remained distant, its clouds gathering slowly on the horizon while the White House continued its work, unaware of how close the coming turning point truly was. As 1973 unfolded, the Watergate investigation evolved from a quiet curiosity into a widening path of questions that no longer faded with time. What had begun as a seemingly minor incident now drew the attention of federal prosecutors, judges and journalists who refused to let the story disappear. Inside the White House, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained as Nixon and his advisors watched the situation shift from a small distraction into a slow-moving threat. Nixon believed that his enemies were using the investigation to weaken his presidency. This belief intensified his instinct to resist cooperation, fearing that even limited transparency could be twisted against him. He continued to insist that the break-in had been a rogue operation, unrelated to his leadership. But as investigators followed financial records, phone calls and testimonies, the threads began to reach closer to people within his administration. The pressure mounted when several of the burglars were convicted and faced long prison sentences. Some began hinting that they had been promised money and protection if they stayed silent. Whispers of a possible cover-up reached the public, creating a sense that something deeper was hidden beneath the surface. Journalists, especially those determined to uncover the truth, pushed harder. Their reporting sparked new leads and raised new suspicions, while the White House worked quietly to dismiss their claims as politically motivated. Nixon tried to focus on governing, continuing diplomatic talks and economic initiatives. Yet even in moments of progress, the shadow of Watergate followed him. His staff noticed a growing sense of unease in him, a tension that lingered during meetings and overshadowed achievements that might otherwise have defined his second term. The strain deepened when the Senate voted to form a special committee to investigate the scandal publicly. Televised hearings were announced, ensuring that the entire nation would watch the details unfold live. This development struck at the very core of Nixon's fears, not only the investigation itself, but the spectacle, the public scrutiny, and the possibility of humiliation on a national scale. As preparations for the hearings began, figures within Nixon's inner circle started to question how much longer the truth could be contained. Some urged caution, others recommended limited cooperation, but the fear of political damage overwhelmed clear decision-making. Every small choice about documents, testimony, and statements became a source of conflict. Some advisors began distancing themselves, aware of the growing danger. Others doubled down, determined to protect the president at all costs. Through it all, Nixon clung to the hope that the crisis would fade, that distractions or political shifts would take the nation's attention elsewhere. But the momentum had changed. What once seemed manageable had begun to move forward with a force that no one could stop. And as the hearings approached, the White House braced for a chapter that would expose old decisions, challenge long-held loyalties, and test the president in ways he had never imagined. When the Senate Watergate hearings began in May 1973, the quiet tension that had been building for months finally broke into the open. Televised nationwide, the hearings brought every detail of the investigation directly into American living rooms. Millions watched as witnesses described events, conversations, and decisions that suggested the break-in was not an isolated act, but part of a broader pattern. For Nixon, this public exposure felt like a deepening wound, a situation he no longer controlled and a narrative he could not steer. Inside the White House, advisors scrambled to prepare for each new revelation, hoping to stay one step ahead of the testimony. But the hearings introduced surprises that even the administration did not anticipate. Former aides spoke under oath about conversations they believed pointed to attempts to conceal the truth. They described the pressured environment, the secrecy, and the urgency that followed the break-in. Though some testimonies were vague or contradictory, The overall effect was damaging. The public began to wonder how far the truth reached and who inside the administration had authorized key decisions. Nixon tried to maintain a posture of calm leadership, often addressing the nation to emphasize his focus on foreign policy, economic stability, and national progress. Yet even in these speeches, a faint strain was noticeable. He spoke firmly, but the confidence he projected no longer resonated the way it once had. The hearings elevated a number of unexpected figures into national attention, including a soft-spoken former counsel named John Dean. His testimony became one of the most dramatic moments of the entire investigation. Dean described meetings where he warned the president of a cancer on the presidency, suggesting that continued concealment would only worsen the situation. Though Nixon denied the accuracy of Dean's statements, the image of internal alarm within the White House struck a nerve with the public. The hearings also revealed something that stunned both investigators and the nation: the existence of a secret taping system in the Oval Office. It had been installed to preserve records of conversations for historical purposes, but now it became the focal point of the investigation. If the tapes existed, they could confirm, or refute, what had been said behind closed doors. Suddenly, everything hinged on these recordings. Congress, prosecutors, and reporters demanded access, seeing them as the most reliable evidence available. Nixon hesitated, claiming executive privilege and arguing that releasing the tapes would compromise national security and the privacy of presidential discussions. But his resistance only fueled further suspicion. As summer turned to fall, the battle over the tapes became the defining struggle of the investigation. The question was no longer simply what had happened at Watergate, but whether the president would comply with the demands of the legal system. Each passing week intensified the pressure. Each refusal raised new questions, and each moment of hesitation chipped away at the public confidence Nixon had spent a lifetime building. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would push the presidency into uncharted territory. A struggle between executive power, the law, and the truth waiting quietly on a set of tapes that no one outside the Oval Office had yet heard. As the fight over the tapes intensified, the atmosphere around the Nixon administration grew increasingly fragile. What had begun as a political problem was now becoming a constitutional confrontation, one that tested the boundaries of presidential authority. Nixon remained convinced that releasing the tapes would set a dangerous precedent, weakening not only his own office, but those of future presidents. Yet the pressure from investigators, Congress, and the courts mounted steadily. Throughout the summer and into the early fall of 1973, negotiations dragged on. Nixon offered summaries of the tapes rather than the tapes themselves, insisting that this would satisfy investigative needs while protecting confidential discussions. But critics argued that summaries could be edited, interpreted, or selectively written. They wanted the exact recordings, unaltered and complete. The courts began weighing in, and each ruling tightened the grip on the White House, limiting the president's ability to refuse. At the same time, Nixon faced another crisis that shook the government: the resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew. Agnew stepped down after unrelated charges involving tax issues, forcing Nixon to select a new vice president under the 25th Amendment. He chose Congressman Gerald Ford, a well-respected figure known for honesty and steadiness. Ford's presence briefly calmed public nerves, but it did little to slow the pace of the Watergate investigation. The country continued to watch closely, and many sensed that the presidency itself was drifting into peril. The breaking point came in late October, during what would become known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox insisted on access to the tapes, refusing to accept Nixon's proposed summary. Nixon, determined to stop him, ordered the Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. The Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, also refused and resigned. The task finally fell to Solicitor General Robert Bork, who carried out the order. The sudden wave of resignations shocked the nation. It appeared to many like an attempt to halt the investigation through force rather than cooperation. protests erupted, newspaper editorials grew harsher, and members of Congress from both parties expressed concern. For the first time, impeachment was openly discussed. Nixon, realizing the damage this event had caused, reversed course and announced that he would comply with the court's order to release some of the tapes. But the harm was already done. Trust in the administration dropped sharply, and support within his own party began to weaken. Still, Nixon pressed on, insisting publicly that he had done nothing wrong. His speeches emphasized stability, legality, and the importance of protecting the presidency from overreach. Yet behind the scenes, even loyal advisers sensed the shift. The crisis was no longer contained. It had grown larger than political strategy, larger than media battles, larger even than Watergate itself. It had become a test of truth, a test that would soon reveal more than the president ever expected when those tapes finally came out. When the first batch of tapes was finally released in late 1973, the country listened closely, hoping for clarity. Instead, the recordings raised even more questions. Many sections were muffled, incomplete, or difficult to interpret. There were long stretches of silence, sudden shifts in tone, and moments where voices were barely audible. But beneath the noise, investigators found enough details to confirm that administration officials had discussed strategies to manage the Watergate fallout. Conversations that hinted at efforts to contain the investigation long before the public knew its full scope. One tape included an 18 1-2-minute gap, an omission so striking that it quickly became one of the most infamous mysteries of the entire scandal. Nixon's secretary Rosemary Woods claimed she accidentally erased the section while transcribing it, but few believed that explanation. The gap became a symbol of suspicion, a reminder that the full truth might be hidden behind fragments and technical errors. Meanwhile, testimony from former officials added pressure. Senior aides, once loyal, began cooperating with investigators to protect themselves. Their accounts differed in details but aligned in tone, painting a picture of an administration overwhelmed by secrecy and reactive decisions. For the public, the contrast between Nixon's calm speeches and the emerging evidence created a growing sense of uncertainty. Was the president unaware of the cover-up, or had he quietly approved actions his aides carried out? Nixon insisted he had no knowledge of efforts to obstruct justice. He argued that conversations on the tapes were being misinterpreted, that political pressure was distorting perception, and that he was still focused on governing. He emphasized foreign policy breakthroughs, including ongoing negotiations with the Soviet Union and efforts to maintain stability in a rapidly changing world. But his words no longer carried the same weight they once did. Confidence in the administration steadily eroded. Members of Congress reported receiving thousands of letters from constituents expressing concern, frustration, or disappointment. Even some Republicans, traditionally among Nixon's strongest defenders, began to say that the White House needed to provide clearer answers. Through it all, Nixon grew increasingly isolated. Meetings became shorter, trusted advisers dwindled, and the Oval Office felt quieter than ever. Those who remained close to him sensed the emotional strain. He was not visibly broken, but there was a heaviness in his posture, a weariness in his voice, as though years of pressure had finally begun to settle on him all at once. Yet despite the tension, he still believed he could survive the crisis. He thought time, diplomacy, and economic progress would slowly shift public attention away from Watergate. But Watergate had taken on a life of its own. Investigators continued to uncover new information, journalists pushed further, and courts issued additional orders. The truth, once distant, was now moving closer from all directions, and with every revelation, the presidency edged one step nearer to a moment Nixon had never imagined facing. A moment when the full weight of his decisions would finally be impossible to escape. By early 1974, the Watergate investigation had become an unstoppable force, and each new development tightened the pressure around the presidency. What once felt distant and manageable now grew dangerously close, weaving itself into every aspect of Nixon's life and work. The courts issued more rulings demanding that additional tapes and documents be released, rejecting arguments about executive privilege. The legal battle was no longer simply about political strategy. It had become a defining test of the balance between presidential powers and the justice system. Nixon tried to continue governing, holding meetings, delivering speeches, and addressing national concerns. Yet even in moments of progress, the mood around him remained tense. Advisers who had once been confident now appeared subdued, worn down by months of scrutiny and uncertainty. Some quietly resigned, believing the investigation would soon engulf the administration entirely. Others stayed, hoping to help Nixon navigate the crisis, but even they sensed the narrowing path ahead. The country itself felt divided. Some Americans believed Nixon could still recover, arguing that his accomplishments, especially in foreign policy, outweighed the mistakes surrounding Watergate. Others felt increasingly convinced that the president was hiding the full truth, and that the tapes, once fully released, would reveal his involvement. Congress intensified its efforts as well. Committees reviewed thousands of pages of documents, listened to hours of testimony, and debated the seriousness of the allegations. Talk of impeachment began to spread more openly, no longer confined to editorials or public speculation. Members of both parties quietly discussed the possibility, aware that the evidence was growing more complicated with time. Inside the White House, Nixon oscillated between determination and frustration. He believed deeply in his own strength, convinced that history would eventually judge him more kindly than the present moment. At the same time, he felt betrayed by many who once supported him, interpreting criticism as personal rejection. He vented privately about the press, the investigators, and political opponents, expressing a deep sense of injustice. Yet he also had moments of reflection, acknowledging to close aides that mistakes had been made, though he seldom specified which ones. When a court demanded yet another set of tapes, Nixon complied reluctantly, releasing more recordings that revealed conversations filled with political calculations, candid assessments of allies and enemies, and occasional profanity. None of these interactions were unusual for private political discussions, but hearing them on tape shocked some Americans. The recordings painted a picture of a president far more blunt and defensive than the calm, measured leader they saw on television. Still, the most damaging evidence had yet to surface. Investigators believed there were tapes from key dates that might finally clarify what Nixon knew about the cover-up and when he knew it. The battle for those recordings intensified, and Nixon's legal team fought every step of the way. But momentum had shifted. The judiciary pressed harder, Congress grew more unified in its resolve, and public patience waned. As spring turned to summer, the White House entered a new phase, one defined not by speculation, but by the expectation that the defining revelation was near. The nation waited, watching closely, sensing that the truth, long delayed, was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. By the summer of 1974, the search for the remaining tapes reached a level of intensity no one in the White House could ignore. The courts, Congress, and the special prosecutor all demanded full access, arguing that the unresolved recordings were essential to determining whether the president had participated in efforts to obstruct justice. Nixon's legal team continued to resist, offering edited transcripts instead of the original audio. But each delay only increased distrust. Lawmakers and investigators insisted that only the unaltered tapes could reveal the truth. Even many Republicans agreed that transparency was now unavoidable. The legal battles culminated in a landmark Supreme Court case, United States versus Nixon. The argument centered on whether the president could use executive privilege to withhold evidence in a criminal investigation. Nixon believed firmly that the confidentiality of presidential discussions was fundamental to effective leadership, yet the justices saw the issue differently. On July 24, 1974, they delivered a unanimous ruling against him. The court declared that not even a president was above the law and ordered the immediate release of the tapes. The decision shook the nation. Inside the White House, the announcement landed like a heavy, irreversible shift. Staff members understood instantly that the struggle to protect the recordings had reached its end. Nixon appeared composed in public, but those close to him noticed a profound change, a quiet resignation creeping into his posture as though he sensed the walls closing in. When the tapes were finally turned over, investigators began reviewing them with meticulous detail. Among the recordings, they discovered a conversation from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. In it, Nixon and his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, discussed using the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. The exchange revealed a clear attempt to interfere with the inquiry, something far more direct than previous evidence had suggested. This single recording, soon known as the smoking gun, transformed the political landscape overnight. Members of Congress who had previously defended Nixon found themselves unable to justify their support. The revelation was too explicit, too decisive. The House Judiciary Committee, already evaluating articles of impeachment, quickly accelerated its efforts. They charged Nixon with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress, allegations that carried immense gravity. Meanwhile, public opinion shifted sharply. Many Americans who had once believed the president's explanations now felt betrayed. The tapes confirmed not only actions taken during the cover-up, but also the tone and mindset within the Oval Office, revealing a level of involvement that few had imagined. Within days, key Republican leaders visited Nixon privately at the White House. Their message, delivered calmly but firmly, was devastating. He no longer had enough support in Congress to survive impeachment. If he chose to remain in office, he would almost certainly be removed. The meeting marked a turning point. For the first time, Nixon understood that his decades-long pursuit of power, influence, and recognition had brought him to a point from which he could not recover. Impeachment was no longer a distant threat. It was the inevitable next step unless he chose a different path. And so, the question that would define the end of his presidency began to take shape quietly in his mind. Whether to fight until the final vote or to leave office on his own terms before the process could run its course. In the days following the smoking gun revelation, the White House felt suspended in a strange, heavy stillness. The once busy corridors grew quieter, meetings were shorter, and conversations that had once carried urgency now carried resignation. Nixon moved through these days with a controlled calm that masked an overwhelming inner weight. Those closest to him sensed that he was grappling with the reality of what lay ahead. Not just the political consequences, but the personal reckoning that came with watching a lifetime of ambition collapse in a matter of weeks. Advisors who had stood beside him for years understood that the choices before him were shrinking rapidly. Impeachment in the House was certain. Conviction in the Senate was nearly guaranteed. The question was no longer whether he could survive politically. It was whether he should force the country and himself through the long and painful process that impeachment would bring. Nixon consulted with his family, his remaining advisors, and a handful of congressional allies. Each conversation, though carefully measured, moved toward the same conclusion. Resigning might be the only way to preserve a measure of dignity and protect the office of the presidency from further turmoil. At night, Nixon spent long hours alone in the Lincoln sitting room, reviewing documents, listening to music, and reflecting on the arc of his career. He thought about his early struggles, his rise through Congress, his years as vice president, his dramatic comeback in 1968, and the foreign policy achievements he believed would define his legacy. He also thought about the mistakes, the secrecy, the mistrust, the decisions made under pressure, and how they had slowly woven a web he could no longer escape. Meanwhile, the public waited. Newspapers published front-page analyses, television networks held round-the-clock discussions, and Americans everywhere sensed that a historic moment was approaching. Some hoped Nixon would fight on, believing that stepping down was too heavy a price for his accomplishments. Others felt resignation was necessary to restore trust in government. But everyone understood that the presidency had reached a turning point. As the days passed, Nixon began to speak more openly with his staff about the possibility of leaving office. He asked detailed questions about the process, the timing, and the impact it would have on the nation. He also considered how his resignation would affect Gerald Ford, the vice president who would assume the presidency. Despite the gravity of the situation, Nixon showed moments of clarity and resolve. He wanted the transition to be orderly, respectful, and focused on the stability of the country. For all his flaws and mistakes, he still believed deeply in the importance of the office he held. By early August, the decision was made. Nixon would resign. The announcement would be delivered in a televised address. One final message from a man who had spent decades balancing ambition, brilliance, insecurity, and a relentless desire to shape the world. As preparations began for the speech, the atmosphere in the White House shifted once more. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a reflective calm. Everyone understood they were witnessing history, the end of a presidency unlike any other, shaped as much by achievement as by the quiet shadows that had followed it from the start. On the morning of August 8, 1974, the White House felt unusually still. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, aware that the president was preparing to make an announcement unlike any in American history. Richard Nixon spent the early hours reviewing drafts of his speech, revising phrases, and searching for the right balance between honesty, responsibility, and the dignity he hoped to preserve. Although he had spoken to the nation countless times, this moment carried a weight that no prior address had approached. He understood that millions would be watching, not to hear a policy proposal or a diplomatic breakthrough, but to witness the end of his presidency. As the evening approached, cameras were set up in the Oval Office. Technicians moved with careful precision, adjusting lights and microphones. A small group of aides gathered quietly, their expressions somber. Nixon entered the room slowly, carrying the familiar composure that had accompanied him through decades of public service. Yet beneath the steady posture, those near him could sense a profound blend of sorrow and resolve. When he began speaking, his voice remained calm, steady, and controlled. He acknowledged the erosion of political support, the divisive impact of Watergate, and the need for the country to heal. He did not confess guilt directly, but he accepted responsibility for decisions made under his leadership and for the turmoil that followed. Nixon emphasized his love for the nation, his belief in its strength, and the importance of ensuring that the presidency remained capable of meeting challenges without further distraction. He spoke of accomplishments, peace efforts, foreign policy achievements, and domestic initiatives, framing them as part of a legacy he hoped would not be overshadowed entirely by the scandal. But the tone of the speech was unmistakably weighted with finality. Listeners could hear moments where emotion tightened his voice, especially when he spoke of his family's sacrifices and the steadfast loyalty of those who had stood beside him. When he finished, there was no applause, no celebration, only the quiet realization that an extraordinary and painful chapter in American history had reached its turning point. After the broadcast ended, Nixon stepped away from the desk and paused, looking around the Oval Office as if absorbing its meaning one last time. Staff members, many of them struggling to maintain composure, approached to shake his hand or offer a few quiet words. Though he thanked them all, his expression revealed the immense personal cost of the moment. That night, the White House remained dimly lit as final preparations were made for the transition of power. Nixon retreated to the residence where he spent time with his family, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him here. And as dawn approached, the president, who had once won one of the largest electoral victories in American history, prepared to leave office, carrying with him both the achievements he valued deeply and the mistakes that had ultimately ended his time in one of the most powerful positions in the world. The morning of August 9th, 1974, unfolded with a quiet solemnity that settled over the White House like a heavy fog. Richard Nixon rose early, long before most staff had arrived, and spent his final hours as president gathering personal belongings, signing farewell letters, and moving slowly through the residence with a reflective calm. Although he had spoken publicly the night before, the reality of leaving office now felt more immediate, more personal. He understood that within a few hours he would no longer be president, a shift as monumental emotionally as it was historically. As the staff assembled in the East Room for his farewell remarks, Nixon entered with his family beside him. He looked tired but composed, carrying the same determination that had defined his public life. When he began to speak, his tone was warm and deeply human, in a way that surprised some listeners. He talked about perseverance, hardship, and the lessons he had learned through decades of public service. He spoke of his parents, of their struggles and strength, and of the values they taught him. Values he hoped had guided him through moments of triumph as well as failure. At times, emotion broke through his voice, especially when he addressed the staff members who had remained loyal through the most difficult months. He thanked them for their service, their patience, and their dedication, acknowledging the immense pressures they had endured. There were moments of reflection, moments of sorrow, and moments of unexpected sincerity. Some in the room wiped tears from their eyes, others stood motionless, absorbing the weight of the moment. When the speech ended, Nixon turned and walked slowly toward the exit, pausing briefly as if imprinting the scene into memory. Outside, Marine One waited on the south lawn. The helicopter's blades turned steadily, creating a rhythmic hum that filled the humid air. Nixon and his family descended the steps of the White House for the last time, greeted by a small group of staff and reporters. As he reached the helicopter, he turned back and offered a final gesture, a familiar wave, both hands raised in his trademark pose, a gesture that carried traces of confidence, defiance, and farewell all at once. Then he boarded, and the doors closed. The helicopter lifted gracefully into the air, rising above the White House grounds and heading toward Andrews Air Force Base. From there, the Nixon family would fly to California, beginning a new and uncertain chapter far from the center of power. Back in Washington, preparations for the transition proceeded swiftly. Within hours, Gerald Ford would take the oath of office, becoming the 38th President of the United States. As Nixon's helicopter disappeared into the distance, the nation watched, aware that they had witnessed a moment unlike any before it. The departure of a president who left not through election or term limit, but through resignation, the only one in American history to do so. And with that departure, the story of Richard Nixon entered a new phase. Life after the fall, a long journey toward reflection, accountability, and the search for a legacy beyond the shadow that had brought his presidency to its end. As Richard Nixon settled into life after the presidency, the contrast between his past and present became unmistakably stark. Only days earlier, he had lived at the center of global power, surrounded by advisors, schedules, and constant demands. Now, in the quiet of his home in San Clemente, California, he found himself confronting a silence that felt both calming and unsettling. The transition was abrupt, and the enormity of what had happened still hung over him like a weight he could not quite lift. In the beginning, Nixon kept mostly to himself. He spent long hours walking the grounds of the estate or sitting alone in his study, reflecting on the choices that had shaped his rise and fall. For the first time in decades, there were no briefings, no meetings, no crises demanding immediate decisions. The sudden emptiness left him with space to think, to regret, and to reckon with the reality that he had left office under circumstances unprecedented in American history. Meanwhile, public opinion remained sharply divided. Some Americans felt anger and disappointment, convinced that Nixon had betrayed their trust. Others felt sympathy, believing he had accomplished great things and deserved understanding rather than condemnation. Editorial pages debated his legacy. Scholars discussed the constitutional implications of his resignation, and television programs revisited Watergate again and again, making it difficult for Nixon to escape the shadow of the scandal. Financial pressures soon added another layer of difficulty. Legal fees from the Watergate investigation had grown enormous, forcing Nixon to take out loans and consider new ways to generate income. He began working on his memoirs, hoping they would offer not only financial relief, but also a chance to present his own perspective. Writing became a daily ritual, providing a sense of structure and purpose. The process was emotional and demanding, requiring him to revisit painful moments with clarity and honesty. Throughout this period, Nixon's health began to fluctuate. The emotional strain of the previous years had taken a toll, and he suffered from bouts of illness that required medical attention. Still, he maintained a disciplined routine, determined not to let personal difficulty define the rest of his life. He received occasional visitors, family, close friends, and a few political allies who still believed in his capabilities. Their presence offered comfort, though Nixon sometimes struggled with feelings of embarrassment and frustration. Yet his resilience remained. Even in the lowest moments, he believed deeply in the importance of public service and the value of contributing to national discourse. As the months passed, talk of impeachment faded and the political world moved forward. Nixon remained out of the spotlight, but his mind stayed active, watching global events unfold with the same analytical precision he had always possessed. Slowly, he began to consider how he might re-emerge, not as a politician seeking office, but as a writer, thinker, and voice on foreign policy. His formal years in government were over, but he still hoped to play a role in shaping how the world understood the complexities of leadership, diplomacy, and the lessons of his own experience. In this quiet chapter, Nixon began the long process of rebuilding a life defined not by the presidency he lost, but by the perspective he gained after stepping away from power. As Nixon continued to adjust to his new life in San Clemente, he gradually emerged from the initial fog of resignation and began rebuilding his identity outside the presidency. Though still weighed down by public scrutiny and legal trouble, he slowly rediscovered the steady discipline that had guided him since childhood. Each day followed a quiet routine: early morning walks along the coastline, hours spent writing, and evenings filled with reading reports on world affairs. Even without official power, Nixon remained deeply engaged with global politics, tracking events with the same meticulous attention he had once brought to the Oval Office. His memoirs became his first major project. Determined to explain his side of the story, he poured his energy into recounting his career in detail. The triumphs, the missteps, the unseen pressures. The writing process forced him to confront painful memories, including moments he would rather have forgotten, but it also provided a structure that helped him navigate the emotional fallout. This effort eventually resulted in a best-selling book, offering him both financial relief and the beginning of a slow reputational recovery. During this period, Nixon maintained a low public profile, but he welcomed correspondence from supporters. Letters arrived from people who admired his foreign policy achievements, from citizens who believed he had been treated unfairly, and from individuals simply offering comfort. These messages touched him in ways he rarely expressed openly. They reminded him that despite the scandal, segments of the public still saw value in his contributions. Meanwhile, the Ford administration made a decision that would shape the next chapter of Nixon's life. President Ford issued a full pardon for any crimes Nixon might have committed during Watergate. The announcement shocked the country. Some saw it as a necessary step toward healing. Others viewed it as a miscarriage of justice. For Nixon, the pardon brought immediate legal relief, but also deepened his awareness of how divided the nation remained over his legacy. Though grateful, he understood that many Americans saw the pardon as an undeserved gift rather than an act of compassion. Privately, Nixon struggled with the emotional complexity of this moment. He appreciated Ford's courage but remained troubled by the implication that he had needed pardoning in the first place. Still, the decision allowed him to focus on recovery, physically, financially, and emotionally. His health, however, continued to fluctuate. Stress-induced illnesses became more frequent, and doctors urged him to slow down. Nixon, never one to retreat completely, resisted, but eventually adopted a gentler pace. He held conversations with scholars and journalists from time to time, offering insights on foreign policy. These meetings remained private, but word began to spread that Nixon's analytical mind was unchanged. By the late 1970s, invitations quietly arrived from institutions seeking his perspective. Though he declined public appearances, he sensed the gradual shift. The country was beginning to see him not only as the man who resigned, but also as the complex strategist he had always been. And while the shadow of Watergate still lingered, Nixon's path forward, one built on reflection, writing, and measured engagement, had finally begun to take shape once again. By the early 1980s, Nixon's life had settled into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. Though he would never again hold public office, he slowly rebuilt a reputation as a thoughtful elder statesman, especially in the realm of foreign policy. Invitations to speak at private forums, think tanks, and academic gatherings arrived discreetly, often from people who believed that his strategic mind still held value for the country. Nixon accepted these opportunities carefully, choosing settings where discussions focused on international relations rather than his resignation. In these private rooms, he analysed global shifts with the same intensity he once brought to the Oval Office. He spoke about the changing dynamics of the Cold War, the rise of new political powers, and the future of US-China relations. Those who listened often remarked that his insight remained sharp, unclouded by the years of scandal. At home, Nixon continued writing. After the success of his memoirs, he published additional books on diplomacy and global affairs, each one reinforcing his identity as a strategist rather than a disgraced former president. Critics remained divided. Some praised his depth of knowledge, while others questioned whether he deserved a platform at all. But the book sold well, reflecting a public curiosity about his perspective, even from those who did not fully forgive his past. Nixon also began travelling internationally again, though never with official authority. Foreign leaders, especially in China and Russia, welcomed him with respect. They saw him as an architect of important diplomatic shifts, someone whose understanding of global balance could not be dismissed. These trips provided him with a sense of purpose and offered moments of dignity he had feared lost forever. Yet, despite this gradual reintegration, Nixon remained a solitary figure emotionally. Watergate had changed him. It had scarred his confidence, reshaped his relationships, and left him wary of forming new close connections. Only his family and a few trusted aides truly understood the complexity of his inner life during these years. Even in moments of recognition, he carried the quiet awareness that his achievements would always be shadowed by the events that ended his presidency. Nixon's California home became a place of routine. Long walks, careful study of international news, handwritten notes on policy ideas, and evenings spent reviewing manuscripts. Visitors often found him reflective, sometimes even softened by time. He spoke more openly about regrets, acknowledging the mistakes that had haunted him for so long. But he also emphasized the importance of learning from failure, insisting that history should view leaders in the full scope of their actions, not just their worst moments. As the decade progressed, public opinion continued to evolve. Younger generations, who had not lived through Watergate, saw Nixon less as a scandal and more as a historical figure shaped by extraordinary events. Older Americans, while not forgetting the past, grew more willing to acknowledge the complexity of his legacy. And through this slow, uneven process, Nixon found a measure of stability. He knew he would never fully escape the shadow of Watergate, but he also understood that his voice still mattered, that his experience still held value, and that even after the fall from power, there was still space for contribution, not from the centre of the world stage, but from its quiet edges. As the 1980s continued, Nixon's presence in American public life evolved into something both unexpected and strangely steady. Though he remained a controversial figure, people increasingly sought his views on global affairs. The world was changing rapidly. New alliances were forming, old rivalries shifting, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rising and falling in unpredictable cycles. Nixon watched these developments with the same analytical focus he had carried throughout his career. He studied policy reports, followed international newspapers, and wrote long memos outlining his thoughts on diplomacy. Some of these memos he shared privately with government officials who, regardless of their feelings about his past, recognized that his insight into international strategy was often remarkably prescient. His relationship with China remained a central part of his identity. Nearly every major Chinese leader he met treated him with a level of respect he rarely felt at home. They saw him as the architect of the opening that reshaped global politics, and Nixon valued that recognition deeply. These visits reminded him that, despite the storm of Watergate, he had helped create lasting change on the world stage. Back in the United States, Nixon lived a quieter domestic life. He continued writing books, each one expanding on themes of leadership, global transitions, and the responsibilities of superpowers. Though some critics dismissed his efforts as attempts to rewrite his legacy, many readers found value in his thoughtful examinations of world events. Universities occasionally invited him to private discussions, and he participated selectively, always careful to avoid environments where Watergate would overshadow the conversation. Nixon's health, however, began to show signs of strain. Years of stress had worn on him, leading to bouts of illness that required periods of rest. Still, he refused to slow down completely. He believed that staying intellectually active was essential, and his work became a source of purpose even during difficult days. Family remained a grounding force. His daughters, Julie and Tricia, visited often, bringing warmth and familiarity into a life that sometimes felt defined by solitude. Nixon cherished these moments, especially the long conversations that allowed him to step away from politics and reflect on simpler joys. Yet even as the country began re-evaluating its view of him, Nixon never forgot the weight of his past. He spoke rarely about Watergate, but when he did, his tone was reflective rather than defensive. He acknowledged mistakes while also expressing hope that history would eventually view him as more than the scandal that ended his presidency. By the end of the decade, a subtle shift was noticeable. Nixon was no longer seen solely as the president who resigned, but as a complex statesman whose contributions and failures shaped an era. It wasn't redemption in the traditional sense. The wounds of Watergate remained, but it was something quieter, steadier, and perhaps more meaningful. A slow, patient reclamation of his voice in a world that had once shut him out completely. As the 1990s approached, Nixon found himself entering a final chapter, marked by reflection, renewed relevance, and an unexpected measure of respect. Though he never returned to the public spotlight in the traditional sense, his influence quietly resurfaced as the world shifted into a new and uncertain era. The Cold War, which had defined much of his political life, was changing rapidly. Old alliances cracked, new tensions emerged, and the Soviet Union showed signs of profound instability. Nixon followed these developments closely, offering private advice to members of Congress, scholars, and even presidents who valued his deep understanding of global strategy. His insights, sharp, analytical, and grounded in decades of experience, proved strikingly accurate. Some officials, once hesitant to associate with him, now welcomed his perspective. He wrote articles and books outlining the challenges of a post-Cold War world, warning against complacency and emphasizing the need for careful diplomacy. These works earned attention not for the author's past, but for the clarity of his analysis. Increasingly, Nixon's voice became part of national conversations about foreign policy, even if his involvement remained mostly behind the scenes. Despite this gradual reacceptance, Nixon's personal life remained disciplined and understated. He still began each day with long walks, reviewed international newspapers, and maintained correspondence with leaders around the world. He was older now, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp, engaged, and hungry to understand the shifting political landscape. His home in New Jersey, where he had moved after leaving California, became a place of both solitude and quiet activity. Visitors noted shelves filled with handwritten notes, stacks of newspapers marked with comments, and folders containing drafts of speeches or essays he might never publish. He approached each day with purpose, even if the world no longer demanded it of him. Yet age began to show its presence more clearly. Nixon experienced moments of fatigue and recurring health issues that reminded him of the limits time imposes on all people, even former presidents. Still, he pushed through, determined to contribute as long as he could. Family, as always, remained central. His daughters and grandchildren brought joy and comfort, offering the grounding presence he needed to balance the intellectual intensity of his work. He cherished the hours spent with them, walking in the garden, sharing stories, or simply sitting in calm silence. Public opinion continued to evolve. Younger generations viewed him with curiosity more than anger, seeing him not as a villain but as a complicated historical figure. Documentaries, books, and interviews began presenting more nuanced perspectives on his legacy. While Watergate remained a defining part of his story, it was no longer the only part being remembered. Nixon understood that full redemption was impossible, but he also sensed that history was beginning to make room for complexity, acknowledging both his achievements and his failures. And as he moved deeper into the decade, he seemed increasingly at peace with the idea that legacies are not defined by single moments, but by the whole of a life lived through triumph, hardship, and the long search for meaning after the fall. In 1992, as Richard Nixon stepped into his late 70s, the world he had spent a lifetime studying was undergoing dramatic transformation. The Soviet Union had collapsed, Eastern Europe was redefining itself, and the global balance of power shifted in ways he had once predicted, but never imagined he would live to witness. Though long removed from office, Nixon's understanding of global strategy suddenly felt essential again. Invitations for commentary increased, and he responded with thoughtful essays and interviews that demonstrated the sharpness of his mind, even as age pressed quietly against him. He wrote Seize the Moment, a book urging the United States to take a constructive role in shaping the post-Cold War world. The book received attention from policymakers, analysts and scholars who appreciated Nixon's ability to see long-term patterns where others saw only immediate change. Despite the persistent shadow of Watergate, his foreign policy insights continued to open doors that had once closed firmly against him. Yet behind these intellectual pursuits, Nixon's personal life grew quieter. His home became a steady routine of writing sessions, phone calls with world leaders, and evenings spent with family. He received letters daily, from students writing papers on his presidency, from supporters offering gratitude, from critics expressing complex emotions about his legacy. Nixon read nearly all of them. Some he answered, others he kept as reminders of the wide spectrum of public opinion that had been part of his life for decades. Though he seldom spoke about regret openly, those close to him sensed that the emotional weight of his resignation never fully lifted. Still, he rarely allowed that burden to overshadow his work. He believed deeply in learning from failure, and he often said privately that the world offered no perfect leaders, only those who tried, stumbled, and kept trying. In early 1993, Nixon's world shifted again when his wife, Pat, fell seriously ill. For years she had been his anchor, calm, reserved, and unwaveringly loyal through every rise and fall. Nixon remained by her side through hospital visits and long days of quiet companionship. Her decline marked one of the most painful periods of his later life. When she passed away in June of that year, Nixon was devastated. Those who visited him afterward found him more fragile than they had ever seen, speaking softly about how much she had endured and how deeply he missed her presence. Yet even through grief, he continued writing and reflecting, channeling his emotions into letters and journals that revealed a tenderness seldom visible during his political years. After Pat's death, Nixon seemed to age more quickly. His public appearances grew rarer, his steps slower, but his mind remained active. He continued offering foreign policy advice privately, speaking with the same conviction he had carried since youth. And although his circle grew smaller, his days were still filled with purpose, the kind shaped by a lifetime of service, contemplation, and the quiet pursuit of understanding a world he had helped shape, even long after leaving its higher seat of power. After Pat's passing, Nixon entered a period marked by profound solitude, one that reshaped the rhythm of his final years. His home in New Jersey felt larger, quieter, and filled with echoes of memories that stirred both comfort and sorrow. Friends who visited noticed a gentler side of him, reflective, softer in tone, and more willing to speak openly about the emotional toll of his long life in public service. Though grief weighed heavily on him, Nixon continued to work in the only way he knew how, through writing, studying, and offering thoughtful commentary on world affairs. Even as he retreated further from public view, he remained deeply engaged with global events. He often wrote handwritten notes to policymakers, sharing observations about Russia's turbulent transition, China's evolving role, and the challenges facing a world adjusting to a new geopolitical landscape. His letters carried the tone of an elder statesman, firm, analytical, and shaped by decades of experience navigating international tensions. Some officials quietly admitted that his insights were as sharp as ever. Yet Nixon's health, already unstable, grew increasingly fragile. The stress of the past, combined with age and the loneliness that followed Pat's death, left him more vulnerable to illness. Still, he maintained a disciplined schedule. Mornings were spent reading newspapers meticulously marked with his comments. Afternoons were dedicated to writing, whether for his next book or for personal journals that he never intended to publish. Evenings were quiet, often filled with reflection on the events that had shaped his career. During these moments, Nixon spoke more frequently about Watergate than he had in years. He did not defend his actions as he once had. Instead, he approached the topic with a kind of sombre honesty. He acknowledged to close friends that mistakes had been made, serious mistakes, and expressed a hope that history would eventually examine his presidency in full rather than through a single lens. His daughters remained a steady source of strength. Julie and Tricia visited often, bringing warmth and companionship that eased the loneliness of his home. They encouraged him to rest, to slow down, to enjoy the quieter moments that life still offered. Nixon cherished these visits deeply, appreciating the chance to reconnect with the most personal part of his life, far removed from the pressures of politics. Publicly, Americans continued to debate his legacy. Documentaries, books, and news retrospectives painted complex portraits, some critical, others surprisingly compassionate. Younger generations, lacking a personal memory of the scandal, re-evaluated Nixon through the lens of his foreign policy achievements. Scholars wrote about his role in reshaping global diplomacy, while still acknowledging the shadow of Watergate. Through it all, Nixon seemed at peace with the idea that history would sort through his legacy long after he was gone. His final years were defined not by the pursuit of redemption, but by acceptance, an understanding that life, in all its complexity, cannot be reduced to a single triumph or failure. And in this quiet stage, as he walked slowly through the twilight of his life, Richard Nixon remained what he had always been, a man wrestling with ambition, burdened by mistakes, yet endlessly compelled by the world he had once been sworn to lead. In the spring of 1994, Nixon's life entered its final chapter with a sense of fragile calm. He continued to follow global affairs with unwavering interest, often jotting notes in the margins of newspapers or drafting letters he sometimes never sent. Though physically slower, his mind remained focused, instinctively analysing every geopolitical shift. Visitors noticed that he still spoke passionately about Russia's transformation, China's long-term strategy, and America's role in shaping the future. But they also sensed a deeper vulnerability beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement that time was catching up with him. Despite his weakening health, Nixon kept a steady routine. He spent mornings reviewing news, afternoons editing the manuscripts he hoped to finish, and evenings reflecting on memories that seemed to come more frequently now. Many of these reflections revolved around his early years in public service, the rigorous debates in Congress, the exhausting vice presidential campaigns, and the tense moments in the Oval Office during moments of crisis. He spoke about them not with pride alone, but with the gentle tone of someone evaluating a long, complicated life. On April 18, 1994, everything changed suddenly. Nixon suffered a severe stroke while at home, collapsing without warning. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors quickly determined that the damage was extensive. Within hours, news of his condition spread across the nation. Networks interrupted regular programming, journalists gathered outside the hospital, and Americans, whether admiring, critical, or simply reflective, found themselves watching the final days of a man who had shaped an era. Nixon remained unconscious, surrounded by his daughters and close family members who kept vigil by his bedside. They held his hands, spoke softly to him, and ensured he was never alone. Messages of support poured in from across the world. Former presidents, foreign leaders, diplomats, and citizens who felt compelled to share their thoughts on a man whose impact, for better or worse, had touched their lives. In Washington, conversation shifted from political disagreements to reflections on history. Commentators discussed his achievements, the opening of China, arms control agreements, strides in environmental policy, alongside the shadow of Watergate. For the first time in decades, the national conversation about Richard Nixon felt balanced, recognizing the full spectrum of his legacy. Nixon never regained consciousness. His health continued to decline quietly, and after several days of close monitoring, doctors informed the family that there was little more they could do. The nation waited, watching updates with a mixture of solemnity and introspection. When he finally passed away on April 22, 1994, the announcement was met with a moment of nationwide stillness. No matter how Americans remembered him, with admiration, disappointment, or complicated respect, they understood they were witnessing the end of a life that had shaped their country in profound and lasting ways. With his death, the story of Richard Nixon shifted once more, moving from the present into history, where his legacy would continue to be debated, studied, and reconsidered for generations to come. After Nixon's death on April 22, 1994, the nation entered a period of reflection, unlike any that had followed the passing of a modern political figure. His life had been marked by extraordinary highs and devastating lows, and now, with his story complete, Americans began to look back with a mixture of grief, curiosity, and renewed contemplation. Tributes poured in from around the world, each one acknowledging a different facet of the man, his strategic mind, his foreign policy achievements, his resilience, and the controversial decisions that had shaped his fall. For many, Nixon's passing was not merely the end of a life, but the closing of a complex chapter in American history. Plans for his funeral began immediately, coordinated between the Nixon family, former colleagues, and officials from across the government. It was decided that the service would take place at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California, the small town where he was born more than 80 years earlier. The symbolism was powerful, a return to the beginning, to the quiet land of citrus groves and early struggles, far from the marble corridors of Washington, where his rise and fall had unfolded. As the day of the funeral approached, dignitaries from across the world arrived in California. Former presidents, foreign leaders, members of Congress, and diplomats gathered to pay their respects. They represented decades of global history, each person connected in some way to policies Nixon had shaped or crises he had navigated. Even political adversaries spoke with a surprising measure of grace, acknowledging his intelligence, his influence, and the unique role he played on the world stage. On April 27, 1994, the funeral commenced beneath grey skies and a steady, sombre wind. Rows of chairs filled the library's courtyard, facing the American flag and the modest gravesite beside the farmhouse where Nixon had spent his earliest years. His daughters, Julie and Tricia, sat in the front row, holding hands tightly as they listened to eulogies that honoured both the achievements and the humanity of their father. President Bill Clinton delivered one of the most notable tributes, speaking of Nixon's profound understanding of the world and acknowledging that history would continue to judge him with nuance. He emphasized that Nixon's experiences, both triumphant and painful, offered lessons for future generations of leaders. Foreign dignitaries echoed this sentiment, describing the impact he had on global diplomacy and the lasting significance of his efforts to bring nations together. As the service continued, those watching from across the country were reminded of the complexity of Nixon's legacy. He had risen from humble beginnings to the presidency, reshaped foreign policy, and then fallen from power more dramatically than any leader before him. His story contained contradictions, lessons, and reminders of the fragile nature of leadership. When the ceremony ended and the casket was carried to its resting place, a collective quiet fell over the gathering. The moment felt both solemn and reflective, an acknowledgement that a long, turbulent, deeply influential journey had reached its final point. And as the last notes of the military salute faded, the nation began to shift from mourning to reflection, turning its attention to the chapters of history that Nixon had helped write, and the ones still being shaped by the impact of his life. In the days following Nixon's funeral, the nation settled into a quieter period of reflection. Newspapers published long retrospectives, television networks aired documentaries, and historians appeared on talk shows to discuss the meaning of his presidency now that his story had reached its final chapter. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a tapestry of contrasting viewpoints, some admiring, some critical, many deeply nuanced. Nixon had always been a figure who defied simple characterization, and even in death, he continued to provoke careful thought rather than easy conclusions. For many Americans, revisiting Nixon's life offered an unexpected perspective on the evolution of their own country. They remembered the turbulence of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the Cold War tensions, and the sense of uncertainty that had defined his political era. They recalled his achievements, opening diplomatic relations with China, initiating arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and reshaping global policy in ways still felt decades later. At the same time, they confronted the reality of Watergate, a scandal that had shaken national trust and forever altered the relationship between the presidency and the public. Scholars, too, began reassessing Nixon with a renewed sense of complexity. Many argued that while Watergate could never be dismissed or minimized, it should be understood alongside the full depth of his impact. His foreign policy decisions continued to influence international relations. His environmental reforms shaped modern regulation. His domestic programs had effects still visible in American society. Others emphasized the psychological dimension of his leadership, the tension between his brilliance and his insecurities, the inner conflicts that had driven both his greatest accomplishments and his most damaging mistakes. Meanwhile, Nixon's presidential library in Yorba Linda became a gathering place for reflection. Visitors walked through exhibits showing his childhood home, campaign memorabilia, and documents outlining his major initiatives. They read letters, annotations, and photographs that revealed the private side of a man often seen only through the lens of politics. Some found themselves surprised by the depth of his early struggles. Others were struck by how human he seemed when viewed outside the shadow of scandal. As weeks turned into months, the conversation around Nixon matured further. Historians began publishing revised works, biographers updated interpretations, and universities hosted panels examining his role in shaping the post-war world. Nixon's legacy, once dominated by a single event, slowly took on greater dimensionality. The public, too, shifted in its perspective. For younger generations, Nixon became less a figure of immediate controversy and more a chapter in history, a leader whose decisions, good and bad, offered lessons about ambition, responsibility, and the weight of power. And through these evolving reflections, one truth became increasingly clear. Nixon's story could not be defined by triumph alone, nor by failure alone. It remained a layered narrative, marked by contradictions that made him not just a political figure, but a profoundly human one. A reminder that history's most influential characters often leave behind legacies as complicated and compelling as the times they lived in. As the years continued to pass after Nixon's death, his place in history slowly settled into a more stable, though still complex position. The passions that once fueled fierce debates began to soften, replaced by a willingness to examine his life through a broader and more balanced lens. Historians, students, and political observers increasingly approached Nixon not as a symbol of scandal or triumph alone, but as a deeply human figure whose strengths and flaws shaped an era of extraordinary change. Academic interest in Nixon grew steadily. Universities hosted conferences examining his foreign policy strategies, his approach to governance, and the psychological factors that influenced his decisions. Scholars wrote new analyses that explored his ability to navigate global tensions, particularly during the Cold War, with an insight that many considered unmatched among modern American presidents. They also explored how his insecurities, long hidden beneath a disciplined exterior, had contributed to the culture of secrecy that ultimately led to Watergate. This duality fascinated researchers. A leader capable of remarkable diplomatic achievements, yet vulnerable to the pressures of political combat in ways that damaged his presidency. Meanwhile, Nixon's recordings and documents, once sources of controversy, became indispensable resources for understanding the inner workings of the presidency. Students listened to audio clips revealing candid conversations, hearing firsthand the intensity, frustration, and strategic thinking that animated the Oval Office during critical moments. These archives offered raw insight into a presidency often defined entirely by its ending, giving future generations the chance to study Nixon's leadership with nuance rather than assumption. Public perception shifted as well. Documentaries portrayed him as a figure shaped by hardship, ambition, paranoia, and brilliance, a combination that made him both effective and vulnerable. Films and books explored his childhood struggles, his early political rise, and the private burdens he carried even at the height of success. For many who had grown up long after Watergate, Nixon became less a villain and more a symbol of how ambition, pressure, and fear can coexist within a single life. His presidential library continued to draw visitors, from school groups to history buffs to ordinary Americans curious about the leader whose choices had shaped so much of modern America. Exhibits expanded to present a fuller picture: his early years of poverty, his military service, his political rise, his diplomatic efforts, and the long shadow cast by Watergate. Even those who remained critical often left with a deeper understanding of the man behind the headlines. In popular culture, Nixon appeared in a range of portrayals, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes harsh, always intriguing. His voice, mannerisms, and contradictions became a subject of study, illustrating how a leader can be remembered for vastly different reasons depending on the lens through which history is viewed. Through this gradual evolution, Nixon's story became less about a single downfall and more about the complexity of leadership. He emerged as a reminder that history rarely deals in absolutes, that even the most consequential figures are shaped by competing forces within themselves. And in this widening understanding, Nixon's legacy found a new kind of stability, a place neither fully condemned nor fully redeemed, but recognized as profoundly human in its struggle, its ambition, and its enduring impact on the tapestry of American history. As time moved further away from the decades Nixon had shaped, his legacy settled into a place defined less by immediate emotion and more by a deeper historical understanding. The intensity of the debates that once surrounded him gradually gave way to thoughtful evaluation. Scholars and citizens alike began viewing his life as a study in contrast, a man whose extraordinary skills in diplomacy coexisted with profound personal flaws, whose strategic brilliance was matched by a persistent sense of insecurity, and whose greatest achievements stood beside actions that ultimately brought down his presidency. In classrooms, Nixon became a central figure in discussions about executive power, political ethics, and Cold War diplomacy. Students studied his decisions not only to understand what happened, but to consider how leadership can be shaped by pressure, fear, and ambition. Professors highlighted his groundbreaking trip to China, the détente with the Soviet Union, and the domestic programs that redefined environmental and regulatory policy. But they also emphasized how secrecy and mistrust can erode even the strongest foundations. Nixon's legacy became a reminder that leadership is fragile, built day by day, but vulnerable to the weight of a few critical choices. His writings, especially the books completed in his final decades, gained renewed interest. Readers found in them not only analysis of global affairs, but glimpses of a man who had spent years searching for understanding and redemption. The tone of these works, reflective, deliberate, and steeped in the lessons of experience, helped reshape public perception, offering a view of Nixon as someone who continued to contribute long after the world had stopped expecting anything from him. Meanwhile, the Nixon Presidential Library grew into a living archive where visitors walked through a full portrait of his life. The exhibits expanded over time to include new documents, oral histories, and artifacts that showed the complexity of his journey. Young visitors learned about the world he inherited, the pressures of the era, and the magnitude of the decisions he faced. Older visitors came seeking perspective, to revisit memories, reconsider beliefs, or simply understand a man whose life had intersected with their own. With each passing year, Nixon's story continued to evolve. Historians published new works, uncovering documents that deepened the narrative, revealing not only the missteps that led to Watergate but the human emotions behind them: frustration, loyalty, fear, and the relentless drive to succeed. Through this slow and steady re-evaluation, Nixon emerged as a figure who could not be defined by one moment alone. His life became a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy, a study in the psychology of power, and a testament to the lasting impact of diplomacy. And as the decades unfolded, his legacy stood as a reminder of the complexity at the heart of all leadership, that greatness and failure can live side by side, shaping the story of a man who climbed to the heights of power, fell from them, and spent the rest of his life trying to understand the meaning of it all.